Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar titled Defining Risk in a New Operating Model. We have a great presentation in store for you thanks to our sponsor, Mega International. Before we get started, here are a few quick tips for the platform. Create your ideal learning experience by moving, maximizing, or minimizing any platform windows. The presentation deck can be downloaded from the Materials window. Live attendees, please use the Q&A window to submit questions. Our speakers will be answering questions at the end of their presentation. If you are experiencing any technical issues, please click on the question mark icon in the platform toolbar at the bottom of your screen. This icon contains an abundance of FAQs and system requirements to help you troubleshoot. Experiencing audio or technical issues? Try refreshing your browser. This practice usually solves most issues experienced. For the CPE credit and certificate process, whether you are viewing the webinar live or on demand, you'll be required to view the 50 minutes of this webinar to be awarded 1 CPE credit. Please see the CPE credit and certificate window to view the countdown timer. Once you have completed 50 minutes of viewing, the CPE certificate for the webinar will automatically be uploaded to the ISACA CPE record section of your ISACA account. Please note this process can take up to 48 hours for the CPE certificate and credit to be applied to your account. Now let's get this presentation started. We have two fantastic speakers with us today, Cyril Amblard and Michael Rasmussen. Without taking too much of their time, I'm going to hand it over to Cyril to start the presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jack, for this great introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here today at Mega International. So my name is Cyril Amblard. I work at Mega International as a product manager, and prior to that, I was working at an advisory firm, mostly in GRC. So I've been spending most of my time doing GRC implementation or GRC projects. Not as long, not as much as our distinguished guest today that you probably know, because he's quite famous in this space because he invented basically the term GRC, Michael Rasmussen. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you, I would say again, and to have a discussion with you today about defining risk in the new operating model. I'm very, very excited to have this conversation with you today.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it as well.
Yep. Well, I have a bunch of questions basically to ask you because, cyber security, IT security is very high on the agenda. So we have a pack of questions, I would say, to cover today. So first, what we will discuss is the challenges of a cyber world. Obviously, cyber attacks and IT spendings are on the rise, and they will probably continue to do so with an acceleration due to digitization. So we will discuss that. We'll discuss also that all those risks linked to cyber attacks and IT spendings bring the need to protect IT assets and data, meaning to secure architecture for the enterprise, and also to take into consideration remote working, IoT, BYOD, all this kind of issue that are thrown at the CISO or CIO. We will discuss also the best practice to ensure IT compliance and security, and how a robust IT compliance strategy can help basically organizations securing their data and IT architectures. And then we will, I would say, conclude with how it is important to have IT compliance part of the global ERM strategy. So before we jump into the conversation with Michael, I just wanted to define what new operating models have in common and what are the varying degrees of risk of the operating models. This is from McKinsey, and I think it's a good, it constitutes a good introduction to our discussion today. Obviously, today there are many challenges. Ensuring IT security, avoiding operating disruption, securing data, ensuring compliance, managing complexity and change, avoid financial and reputational damage. So those topics we will discuss with Michael in a few moments. Obviously, the operating models is constrained by the existing capability, also the desired speed of transformation by management that wants to go more and more toward digitalization, the level of executive commitments, and also the economic pressure. And I would also say the social media pressure now that is very important. And all those brings, of course, risk to consider. Risks that can be strategic, financial, operational, technological, reputational, and legal. Today, obviously, it's a balancing act between having too much security or not enough security. I would just quote William Webster, the ex-FBI director, that says security is always seen as too much until the day it's not enough, which I think is a good state of what we're about to discuss with Michael. So,
one thing back on that slide, I'll just mention there, is that, sure. I mean, it's a great slide with a lot of great data points, but there's actually so much more that can be added, because even like under the current challenges of today, I mean, it doesn't identify, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, where everything's connected, and cloud computing, operating models, the distributed extended enterprise of third-party relationships and their access to information, data, and processes. I mean, there's so much to pour into this that you can't even capture on one slide, and just the complexity of it.
Yeah, very good point, Michael. I mean, we had to do some arbitrage, but obviously all the topics that you just mentioned we will touch down on them in the following slide.
Yep.
Just, I think it's important maybe to have some figures and not to stay too high level, but to have some, actual figure of what this means. Basically, we have an organization that's under cyber siege. The rise of cybercrime, it's $1 trillion, 1% of world GDP, based on the global cost of cybercrime in 2020. 30,000, that's the number of daily cyber attacks in the US alone. It's around plus 800%, and that's the source of the IBI. Those attacks are getting more and more sophisticated. We can see an industry now of cyber criminal, latest one being the dark side hack on the Colonial Pipeline. And I said that everyone is concerned now. I mean, every company is basically concerned with cyber threats. And it can have dire consequences. It can even lead company to bankruptcies. It's almost a matter of life and death for companies, sometimes with the inability to rebound or to reconstruct the information system that has been damaged. What we see also is that there is a cost associated to this cybercrime. So 3.86 million, that's the global average data cost of data breach in 2020 from the Ponemon Institute. And it takes 280 days from the average time to identify and contain the data breach.
That is the average cost of a data breach around the world. And so it's actually about twice that just in North America alone. And the other thing that's interesting in that Ponemon Institute is that if the data breach involves a third party, which the slight majority of data breaches do involve a third party, like a vendor, supplier, outsourcer, service provider, contractor. In that case, it's about roughly about 10% higher, so about $4.2 million the average cost of a data breach around the world. And again, higher in the U.S., it doubles about that. But so many data breaches and things involving third parties, like SolarWinds and other issues,
very good.
The cost is even higher.
Yep, it's a very good example. So basically, the challenge now is to ensure IT security, avoid operational disruption, because as we just mentioned, it can have dire consequences. We have seen that in Europe with hospitals being unable to function, especially now with this COVID period. So, it can be almost dramatic. And also the need to secure company and client data and avoid, of course, financial and reputational damage, as Michael just mentioned. Cyber threats are not the only challenge that the CIO or the CISO or the IT department has to face. There is also a rise of regulation. We have around 1,000 regulatory bodies, 200 daily regulatory updates, NIST, COVID, SOX, PCI, DSS, GDPR, ISO 27001. So lots of regulation to cover and to be compliant. And there is also a cost of not complying with those regulations. I just put a few here with, in France, for instance, global fine, 57 million, H&M also GDPR fine. British Airways, £20 million, and Telecom Italia, Italian Telecom, $18.6 million. I mean, those are sizable fine that organizations have to consider. If you couple that with the previous slide, which we saw the cyber threats, and you add that with the regulation, I mean, it's almost like a perfect storm for the IT department. And obviously, I mean, IT security has become a top priority across all organizations up to the C-suite. And this trend is probably going to be there for a long time. I don't know, what are your thoughts on this, Michael?
Most definitely. I mean, there's lots and lots of regulatory change, and the figures cited here are just financial services. I mean, there's approximately 1,000 regulators in the financial services space alone, dealing with about 200 regulatory updates. So it could be like a new regulation, a change regulation, an enforcement action globally. And a lot of these impact different aspects of IT systems and information. But that's just financial services. And so technically, there's a lot more than 1,000 regulatory bodies and 200 daily regulatory updates around the world, because that's just the financial services sector specifically.
So lots of challenges, you know, for the IT department. And basically, they also have to ensure compliance with those regulatory standards. They have to manage this complexity, as you just mentioned, Michael, and the change as well, because obviously regulation doesn't stand still. It's a dynamic environment, and also they need to avoid financial and reputational damage. Which brings us, I think, to our first polling question. So I'm just going to read it, and you can start already keying your answer. What is your biggest concern around IT security? Is it a data breach? Is it a regulatory fine? Is it a reputational damage? Is it an operational disturbance? Obviously, we didn't put all of the above because we thought that would be everyone would be answering this question, but that would be interesting to see what we have as the answer comes through. Michael, while we wait for the answer, I just wanted to have your thoughts. I mean, I was reading about this dark side attacks on the colonial pipelines, and the fact that they issue an apologies, saying that, you know, their goal was not to create problem for society, but just to make money. What do you think of that? Do you think there'll be more like this, or?
Oh, there's definitely more that's going to happen. You know, we see compromises like even SolarWinds from a few months ago, and now, you know, the Colonial Pipeline. When you're asking this question, this polling question, I was just sort of thinking in my mind is, I wonder how that's changed this week from 2 weeks ago. Yeah. And we'll see how the answers come in. But I would bet that if you asked this question 2 weeks ago, that D probably be a lot less than what we'll see as of today, because today, you know, with the Colonial Pipeline incident, we saw a huge example of operational disturbance. And so I'm really anxious to see how people answer this question now. And I wish we had the exact same question from a few weeks back, because I bet you it's changed. But, you know, operational disturbance is an absolutely huge issue and challenge.
Yeah, so we can see the result here. I mean, data breach is a winner by far, 62.2% as the biggest concern. Then it's followed by operational disturbance and reputational damage. So 18 for operational disturbance and 17 for reputational damage. Yeah. And regulatory fine, not that much, 2.8%. So we can see, I mean, data breach is really a key.
I bet you that operational disturbance would have come in third or fourth 2 weeks ago. But it's second now. But obviously, data breach is a top-of-mind issue. But the other thing to be aware of when it comes to Colonial Pipeline, to answer your question, is that, I mean, this is a commercial-focused hacking group. You know, again, still very much practicing the dark arts, because, you know, they're the chaotic, neutral, chaotic, evil type organization that is going to, you know, do whatever it can to make money and break laws and rules, and in that case, disrupt business. I mean, that's their motive. So it is a bad organization. But the reality is that if a hacking group has access to this infrastructure and has been able to do this, you can pretty much count that some foreign governments out there also have that same access and have just, waiting and hiding for some, global tensions to arise.
Yep.
So, I mean, from my point of view, if a commercially minded, black hacking group it has been able to do this, you can bet, dollars of donuts that you've got a lot of other foreign governments that have been infiltrated and have the keys to the kingdom waiting for some global development to happen.
Yeah, I mean, we have a comment here. I'm just reading it live because someone asked if all those are unconnected at the end, because when you have a data breach, obviously, the rest follows, which is, perfectly true. We just segmented the questions from this, that, we could have said all of the above, and that's really true. Usually data breach cascade into regulatory fine, reputational damage, and sometimes in operational disturbance.
They're all definitely interconnected, and different events might select one or two or three or all four of them, depending on the type of the event and how it rolls out. But you have things like COVID-19, which was a health and safety event that cascaded into IT security issues from the work from home environment, increased hacker activities, to even things like bribery, corruption, fraud, and so much other stuff that have peaked up because of COVID-19. It is an interconnected risk environment. And risk is multifaceted, and I wrote an article a year ago on the dominoes of risk, and what starts with one risk impacts a lot of other risks and exposures as well.
Yeah, it's all about, the interconnectedness of risks that you have been, I would say, preaching for so long. Now it's becoming a reality. And we can see that, risks are no longer in isolation, but have, rippling effect throughout all the organization. So
there's a great comment that just flash through there's a great comment that just flashed through the Q&A thing that, at the end, the operational disturbance is the greatest exposure, because if it stops your operations, you're out of business.
True. Yeah, as you know, I'm based in France, and obviously, in France recently we had an apparel manufacturer that just went out of business. They were a victim of ransomware. They refused to pay, but the cost of rebuilding the information system, and it took them 3 months. They just didn't make it. So it has very real effects. It's not like virtual. So we're going to discuss a bit about how can organization protect IT assets and data, and we're going to touch about IT compliance, and we're going to split that into 4 sections, and that's what we will be discussing with Michael today. The first one is obviously to identify all the applicable regulation and industry standards. So we will discuss this part. The second one being, once you have identified all those regulation and standard, you have to map those to your digital assets and processes. So how do you do that concretely? And then once you have done that, how do you continuously monitor and assess your IT security and IT architectures? And then, of course, you have to make IT compliance part of your ERM strategy. Again, it's not isolation, as Michael was mentioning. It has a rippling effect for the organization. So let's start with the first one. Obviously, we're going to leave those best practices there, because they are here to ensure the security of legality and digital assets, improve business resiliency by definition, and also avoid financial and reputational damage. So how can organizations protect IT assets and data? So we're going to start with the first one, Michael. I'm going to throw questions at you, so be ready. So for you, how can regulation and industry standard, provide a solid foundation for IT compliance, meaning, helping organization manage security, IT risk, if you like?
Yeah, it's understanding, what we have to comply with, what's expected of us as far as our obligations. And so it could be a law, it could be a regulation, it could even be civil liability in a lawsuit that we're concerned about. And so what are the obligations upon the organization, but also what are the broader industry standards that might be cross-industry? You have like the NIST standards and ISO 27000 and COBIT and things like that. But then you have industry-specific standards, like using the Colonial Pipeline. What are the FERC and NERC requirements, the Federal Electric Reliability Commission and the North American Electric Reliability Council, and the FERC and NERC guidelines on critical infrastructure. So, you have cross-industry standards and regulations that can be applied to every organization to some level. But then you have industry-specific stuff, like FERC NERC requirements on critical infrastructure protection, or it could be, HIPAA, or it could be, the FFIEC, the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, and the 5 U.S. financial regulators. And I'm throwing some U.S.-specific themes, but we can talk about, FCA over in the UK, EU's DORA, Digital Operational Resiliency Act, and so many more. But, we need to understand the cross-industry standards and best practices, as well as regulations and requirements, as well as the specific industry standards and practices as well, and requirements. And so that will provide the foundation what's expected for us.
Yeah, and that's, that triggers the second question, which is, I'm assuming in lots of everybody's mind. Obviously, how to identify when you're an organization, when you're bombarded with regulation? How do you make sure that you're basically safe and you have all the regulation that concerns you, or the norms, the applicable norms? How to make sure that you get all that into one single container, if I may say that.
And that means really understanding your business and the range of regulations and things that impact it. The challenge here is the pervasiveness of information and technology. And so, what used to be contained in the data center, now, you've got the Internet of Things with everything being connected. And not only do you have to worry about the data center and the corporate networks, but the home office environments. You look around me and my speaker's connected to the Internet, my wall outlets, the TV behind me, my blender, my kitchen's connected. I can program it with my iPhone if I want to. I have no idea why I'd want to program my blender with my iPhone, but I could. If any of these have a vulnerability or a Trojan horse in them, good night. So the challenge now is, not only do we understand the depth and breadth of the regulations and how they apply to the business, but how do we apply it to the complexity and distributed nature of information technology, the home office environment, extended enterprise of third-party relationships, cloud computing. Things are pervasive on both ends, and it adds to this what I call navigating chaos and trying to keep up with the change in the business, the distributed, dynamic, disrupted nature of business, the plethora of regulations and obligations and commitments upon the organization, and being able to keep up with all this is quite a challenge. And so we need to be able to identify not only the range of regulations and standards, the obligations and commitments of the organization, but you have to keep up on keeping them current with a changing dynamic business environment.
And to that point, Michael, I would like to have your thoughts, because obviously there are some providers here that just aggregate contents on different regulation. And should organizations use them? What do you think? What are your views on those providers?
Most definitely. I think organizations need to engage in outside content aggregators. They need to do their due diligence to make sure nothing's being missed. But this is an overwhelming task that organizations that can't keep up with. And that's why you're getting specialized services out there that keep up with what are the changes in evolution of regulations and standards and obligations on organizations, and how do these map to the control environment in a common control area. And so the aggregators of this information, provide a significant value added resource, a resource that organizations themselves, I find, are taxed and do not have time to keep up with. A lot of times I talk to organizations and their control libraries and mapping and things are to what was required of them 5 or 6 years ago, because they just don't have the staff to keep up. One like mid-sized bank I was working with, in their RFP for technology and content in this area, they found that 80% of their staff time in audit and security and risk and compliance, 80% of their staff time was just trying to manage documents and information, not manage risk, not manage security, not manage compliance. They were just trying to manage documents and keep up with things on that end. And because it was just such a task for their staff to do it alone.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, you just answered perfectly how to cope with the next question, how to cope with legislation complexity and also contradiction. I mean, it's true that you have also to have a good grasp of, your regulation. And obviously, I mean, those aggregators can help you there in, coping with this complexity and also sometimes some contradiction because you may not, have the same rules. And it's hard sometimes, which leads me to the next question, to decrypt the various directives and associated IT controls in an intelligible and workable format, because sometimes this is.
Yeah, think about it. If we take the financial services industry figure alone, where we just a few minutes ago, you referenced how there's about 1,000 regulators around the world, and this is coming from Thomson Reuters numbers, and in that context, there's about 200 regulatory change events every business day from these 1,000 regulators of financial services. If you're working in that industry, who has staff to filter through 200, information updates on regulatory change and find out which ones, you need to take action on, and the ones you need to take action on, how do they apply to your control environment? Who has that time? I don't have that time.
Very true. Yeah. And I mean, there is a great comment here. I mean, is just compliance with standard enough, or will it just be a starting point for protection of asset and data? I think that's I mean, it really links to what we're discussing. What we're saying here is that it provides the framework. Obviously, it's not gonna stop or prevent breaches, but it's a good starting base, especially for companies that that don't have a structure framework. I mean, those regulation, those industry standard like PCI DSS, like NIST, they provide a good, solid framework. But of course, you have to go, deeper with, if you look at, security architecture, like zero trust framework. I mean, this is obviously something that you need to do in addition to just having, IT compliance. I don't know, what are your thoughts on this, Michael?
I mean, compliance is a foundation, but ultimately, we need to be able to manage risk. It was referenced that, I spent several years at Forrester, and back in 2002, I defined a model of the market and labeled it GRC, Governance, Risk, and Compliance. The official definition of GRC is a capability to reliably achieve objectives. That's the governance function. While addressing uncertainty, that's risk management. ISO 31000 tells us that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And act with integrity, that's the compliance piece. It's not just compliance. I mean, in fact, that's sort of the tail end of the definition, the acting with integrity. It's about managing the uncertainty and exposure of the organization, because compliance checklists and things just give us a baseline. They don't necessarily address all the risks. So it's not just compliance, it's about risk management. And at the end of the day, it needs to be in a business context, because we have to reliably achieve objectives. They can be entity-level objectives, division-level objectives, department, process, project, or even asset-level objectives, like EU citizen information and GDPR and protecting that. We can define an objective around that. And so we have to understand the objectives to be able to manage the risk and uncertainty and to act with integrity and compliance to those.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, going back to the aggregator, because I can see there are some comments. I mean, one of the feature that is put forward by those aggregators is that they mutualize compliance efforts, and that with one single controls you can basically mutualize different regulation. I mean, have you seen that happens in your in all the projects you're involved with? I mean, is it actually working?
Definitely, it definitely is. But organizations need a process to internalize it, own it, and adopt it. The external aggregator that does the mappings and things, they can be prone to error too. But it also you might have a different interpretation for your environment. And so, having a common control library mapped to regulations, that's great. That gives you 80% of the work done, but it doesn't eliminate all of it, because you still need to make sure that it's the right controls for your environment and the right mappings for your environment, because your environment's unique to anybody else's. And so these aggregators give you a huge advance in addressing this, but it's not complete. You just don't blindly say, oh, that's what we do. You need to make sure that it's the right controls to address your particular risks in your organization.
True. So now, I mean, we've discussed a lot about, regulation and industry standard, but obviously, I mean, you have to know your environment, as you mentioned, and how do you identify, all the digital assets that are in a company, because they're often scattered across the organization, managed in isolation, using different point solution, making the surveillance of the IT ecosystem quite cumbersome. So just, first question for you, Michael, would be basically, how can organization identify basically the completeness of their digital asset? Speaking about technologies, application, and data.
In that, it's going to have to have a thorough understanding of your environment, your systems, your processes, your architecture. To be able to apply what I was just saying, apply it to your organization, not only do you need that content aggregator to bring that in from the external point of view, but you need that thorough understanding of your business and how it operates. And we're seeing a lot of these requirements come forth in some of the regulations out there. You have the FCA, Bank of England, PRA, Operational Resiliency Guidance. You have EU's Digital Operational Resiliency Act. You have Basel and the Bank for International Settlements guidance on operational resiliency. You have the U.S. Office of the Comptroller of the Currencies guidance on operational resiliency. But if you unpack any of these, like the EU DORA, Digital Operational Resiliency Act, it's talking about those digital assets and understanding where they are, how they interact, where they fit in processes, how they cross third-party relationships. You look at the UK's guidance in this area on operational resiliency. It talks about mapping, your processes, your services, your digital and IT systems, not just within your traditional brick and mortar business, but across third-party relationships. Half your organization isn't traditional employees in brick and mortar walls. Half of your organization in general is a web of third-party relationships, contractors, consultants, vendors, suppliers, temporary workers, brokers, agents, dealers, intermediaries. I was talking to a global global automobile manufacturer a few months back. They're completely restructuring their risk management program because half of their risks and things cross all these extended enterprise business boundaries. Because everything's outsourced. If we weren't in lockdowns and you're in the corporate office environment and you're walking down the halls, you're sitting in conference rooms, it's not uncommon that half the people you're associating with in the office are third parties now. And so not only do we have to understand our digital assets within our traditional brick and mortar business and data centers, but also how they extend across third-party relationships. Yep. And now with cloud out there, that even becomes even more pervasive because sales went out and they have their CRM and cloud solution, and somebody else has a cloud solution, like the accounting department and things. And the board of directors with some of the most sensitive information in the organization is using a cloud platform for board papers and management and most confidential and sensitive information of the organization stored on there. And so cloud computing's everywhere in the organization, and we need to be able to address that. And so we need to be able to model our enterprise architecture, our processes and systems, and have a detailed understanding of our business and its various aspects throughout the organization to be able to apply the controls to.
Yeah, let me jump on what you just said, because you mentioned that you need to be able to model using architecture basically to map your IT asset, your process, and your risk and control. Basically, are companies that are using those types of solution that are designed to manage IT architecture? Are they providing already like a head start for managing IT compliance and basically getting a best approach to distribute and manage their IT control across the organization to ensure that they are efficiently protected? Because obviously they have already this map in a single repository, I assume.
Yeah, and to really address that best approach across the organization is to really define and model your enterprise architecture and business processes, understand the criticality and impact tolerances around those, and define the controls that are in place that are going to keep you within defined impact tolerances.
True. You just mentioned prioritize. So that was going to be my next question. How do we start? How do we prioritize the IT compliance effort or the IT security? There's so many IT assets. Do you go for your most critical processes, your most critical data? What would be your recommendation there?
Again, it all ends up in really truly understanding how your business operates and what the most critical services and processes are, and identify the enterprise architecture components that deliver those services and processes for your business. And those high risk ones, the ones that are the most critical, most business critical sensitive systems, address those first.
And that's where risk management comes in handy, I assume, and that we will discuss it in the end, where we integrate IT compliance or IT security in ERM. I mean, that's where you have a risk-based approach, basically, to manage this part and of security.
Yep.
Now, the big question, who should be responsible for managing IT compliance or IT security for that matter? I mean, is it the CISO? Is it the CIO, or a new role?
Well, we could talk job titles, but somebody's got to own this. And so foundationally, I mean, I think it's the Chief Information Security Officer. And that needs to be the role that runs with it. Now, could it be in the Chief Technology Officer or something? Oh, yeah, it could. But I mean, there has to be an established role that oversees this. But the other important point I think that we need to bring out here is that it is most definitely a shared responsibility. Because, let's say it is the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, which is I'm a fan of. That role, isn't the actual owner of all those controls and business processes. It's somebody out there in the business that is. And so to me, the role we're talking about is really a collaborator and communicator with different operational areas of those operations, own those digital and IT assets. And ultimately, if there's an issue, it's their risk exposure.
Yep.
And so to me, the CISO, whatever title is coordinating this, has to be very collaborative with the line of business and operations, because they actually have to own and sign off on the risk.
Yeah. I just saw a comment here about moving to the cloud, and now that things are in the cloud, it's getting making things worse. I have the impression that companies were thinking, okay, we'll all put things on the cloud, because those people, they know that what they're doing, they have high security standards, and basically we will not have to deal with security. But we saw that unfortunately there can be security breach as well in the cloud, and that you have also to make sure that your cloud providers has the same, basically follow the same security principle as you. I mean, it'd be interesting to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, you really need to be able to address security and controls in the cloud environment, and actually provide, audit to provide assurance on that as well. The interesting comment that sort of flashed by in the Q&A was on, I couldn't read it because it went by so quick, but it was the relationship of responsibility and accountability. And I have a whole slide in my presentations on that. Responsibility, I can outsource. I can take tasks and give them to somebody else. But accountability, the buck stops here. I'm accountable. At the end of the day, I think we need to shift the accountability, where the Chief Information Security Officer is not accountable for this. The Chief Information Security Officer has responsibilities, but it's the line of business and operations that own those assets and use those assets, and at the end of the day have to sign off, on risk exposure. They're the ones accountable. And we're starting to see a lot of regulations in this area with accountability regimes. You have the United Kingdom's senior managers regime and certification regime. You have Ireland's SEER, Senior Executive Accountability Regime, Australia's BEAR, Banking Executive Accountability Regime, Hong Kong's Managers in Charge Regime, and Singapore's Individual Accountability and Conduct Regime, that you actually have to have senior management functions that are accountable for different areas of risk, compliance, and control. Not all IT focused, but I think all have IT aspects to them. But some of them are specific, like operational resiliency and things that are very focused on IT controls. And if there's an issue, that senior management function can be personally fined, out of their bank account, not the bank's bank account. And so we're seeing a lot of accountability regimes and things out there that are putting accountability with senior executives that aren't buried in the IT department for some of these different areas.
Yep. So I'm just conscious of time, and we have a lot of questions coming, which means that the subject is of great interest. So we we only have like 20 minutes left, so we're going to have like basically 2 slides, Michael. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to kind of rush you a bit. Obviously, I mean, as we mentioned, I mean, being compliant or ensuring IT security is not static, it's completely dynamic. So you need to continuously assess and monitor your IT compliance status or IT security. I mean, how can organizations get a real-time view of all their IT compliance status and deficiencies? And then I'm going to throw the next one because they are linked. It's also, are there best practices for remediating IT issues, obviously?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it involves understanding an enterprise architecture and business process modeling view of your business and being able to understand, and see dashboards. I mean, here's my, accounts payable process or whatever it might be. And here's how it works. Here's the IT assets and things that support that. And be able to have those type of visuals and alarms that go off when we have control deficiencies or weaknesses, or we're having security incidents and things. To me, we need an enterprise architecture and business process view of our IT systems and our business system, our business operations as a whole, and be able to see that, and then identify critical business services and processes and flag those, because we're going to give more attention to those if there's issues than non-critical ones. And to me, that's the best practice in remediating IT issues, is understanding which ones support or impact, I should say, critical business processes and services.
I'm going to throw not this question because I want to keep it for the end, but as you mentioned, the monitoring. I mean, obviously, you want to monitor some key indicators. You want to be alerted. I mean, are we under attack? On what are we under attack? What is the intensity of the attack? So I assume this is also crucial to have this holistic view. To deal also with IT risk velocity. I'm throwing the previous question as well.
Yeah. When you look at risk, I mean, a lot of times we look at impact and likelihood on a heat map, and I'm not a huge fan of heat maps, but you have likelihood and impact. But the other aspect that's coming in more and more is what you just brought in, risk velocity. And risk velocity has 2 aspects to it. There's speed of onset of a risk. How quickly can this risk materialize and impact the organization? Like a computer virus can hit us like that and take out a data center. While like a human virus like COVID-19, we might see this building up over a few months and things. We have time to react and reposition things. Very different, risk velocities. So with risk velocity, you have the speed of onset, but then you also have, the time to recover. How long will it take us to recover from the risk as well? So when we talk about velocity, I see 2 aspects. But also when you talk about key indicators and automation, we have automation and monitoring of the environment itself and key risk indicators within key business processes. And I'm a big fan of actually how the FCA, Bank of England, and PRA has identified, impact tolerances and being able to measure and understand impact tolerances on key services for operational resiliency. I think that's one way to support those key indicators. But the other key indicators is also, going back to our discussion a few slides ago, is monitoring the external environment. Are we actually keeping up with the regulatory change and enforcement actions and industry standards and practices? We need to be able to not only monitor the key indicators and risks internally to the organization, but also what's changing outside the organization. Because it's not just like importing the control library once and we're good now. We can rest at night for several years. Like, there's 200 regulatory change events, as we stated, every business day. And so we need to keep up with the changes in laws, regulations, and enforcement actions, and make sure our control library and things are consistent to address the changing external environment.
Yeah, I agree. And again, you mentioned the external environment, and that's a perfect introduction to our last slide, because obviously you also mentioned that. As we mentioned, IT compliance is not an isolated act. It needs to be completely encapsulated within your, or an integral component of your global organization ERM strategy. Because obviously, I mean, what are the benefits for you of integrating, ERM with IT compliance?
Because we need an integrated view, because everything is interconnected. I've talked about the dominoes of risk and the interconnectedness of risk. I mean, the physicist Fritjof Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our times, the more we come to realize that they're interdependent and interconnected. The physicist was talking about biological ecosystems, but it applies to business today. Who would have thought that a health and safety risk would have significant IT security ramifications? But COVID-19 has proven that. We have an interconnected risk environment. IT risks and compliance issues cannot be just managed in the bowels of the IT department. We need to understand how these risks and exposures, go throughout the organization. I mean, you take the Target breach from several years ago. The doorway into that was an HVAC vendor. A heating and air conditioning vendor had a connection to the Target network for environmental monitoring. A hacker compromised the HVAC vendor and was able to compromise point of sale systems across Target. A few years ago, you had the breach in the United Kingdom at the casino. Hackers were able to breach the video cameras with the Internet of Things, everything being connected, and was able to have a data breach from there. Everything's so pervasive in our different aspects of the business with cloud computing and Internet of Things. ERM absolutely has to have a view into IT risk, compliance, and security because everything is so pervasive.
Yeah, and especially with your third parties, obviously, because they can be a Trojan horse directly into your, into your organization. If we think about SolarWinds, I mean, that's quite, staggering that, you can basically be a collateral damage. I mean, your organization can be perfectly safe, but if you have someone, a third party, that doesn't follow those standards, it can basically collapse your whole organization system. So, I mean, TPRM, third-party risk management, is a big component that needs to be integrated with IT compliance. But what we've seen is that, how do you have more engagement? Because usually the business is not, I mean, I would say this has changed because obviously, I mean, this is now all over the headlines, but prior to that, it was mostly an IT subject. And it was hard sometimes to get, the CEO attention. I mean, how did you see that, evolve?
And so we can go back to like the Institute of Internal Auditors 3 lines of defense model, now the 3 lines model. Yeah. And historically, we saw a lot of focus on the second and third line. And how do we, have support and understand the back office of IT security as well as IT audit, those elements. But now there's a big push on the first line. And I define the first line a little bit more broadly than Institute of Internal Auditors does, because that first line isn't just operational management. That first line extends all the way down to the frontline employee. The coal miner in the coal mine is making environmental risk decisions and health and safety risk decisions every day. The teller at the bank is making fraud, money laundering, customer privacy decisions every minute of the day. The doctor and nurse at the hospital are making patient safety and patient privacy decisions every day. We need to engage, the front lines of the business, the first line, which includes operational management, but also extends down to the frontline employees. Because that's where a lot of risk materializes, is in the front lines of the organization. And it's also operational management that owns a lot of this risk. And so we need to be able to engage and communicate from the top level board of the organization, but down to the first line employees on IT risks and help build greater risk awareness and a risk culture.
Yeah, you just mentioned that you need to communicate to the, to the board of directors around those issues of IT security. I mean, how can you report effectively to the C-suite? I mean, what's going to get them interested? I mean, because obviously they don't want to know, that, we have patched, I don't know, thousands of servers. What they're going to be interested is that, our sales organization or CRM is secure or this type of info. I mean, how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean, you can't go to the C-level and say, we've got, 101 patches to apply on critical business systems. We need more staff or whatever it is. That's going to their eyes are going to glaze over. You can't go with them with, talking about the complexity of hacker attacks and things when they don't understand, buffer overflows and everything else. We need to communicate with the C-suite and board on, what's the exposure of critical business processes. We have exposure here, and this is how, a hacking group can take out the pipeline. That gets their attention. we need to be able to put it into a business context of what business processes and systems are at risk and what that means to the business and exposure.
And then I think we mentioned, we already touched down on that, but maybe just to get back to, how do you enforce, across your remote and distributed environment, third party, even fourth party? How do you enforce the security standards and you make sure that they are followed? Do you run audit? Do you send questionnaires? What are your thoughts on this?
That's a big challenging problem. And just as we have the pervasiveness of technology and Internet of Things and cloud computing, we also have the pervasiveness of third-party relationships. And, from there, deep supply chains and fourth, nth party and subcontracting and everything else. And so good contracts is where we start. Communication of policies, doing regular questionnaires and assessments that are done at least on an annual basis, but can also be triggered when certain events happen between those periodic bases, but also providing assurance. How do we exercise our right to audit clauses? One Fortune 100 brand that I worked with on one of their third-party risk boards, they had 20,000 facilities that served them around the world. And they ranked every facility in a high, medium, low level, high, red, yellow, green, high risk, moderate risk, and low risk. And high risk facilities had to have an on-site inspection or audit every year to validate. Medium risk facilities had to have an on-site inspection to provide assurance every 2 years. And low risk facilities, the green ones, which the majority of them were, were randomly sampled. So out of 20,000 suppliers, you might do 100 on-site audits and inspections of low risk facilities every year.
Okay.
But at some level, there's a level of trust, and the organization has to show that its due diligence to address this. And this due diligence is becoming more important. Not just within security, but in broader ESG, which includes security. When you see that ESG word, environmental social governance, a lot of people focus on the E, the environmental, but the G is just as important. And you unpack that G and you get into things like IT security, you get into money laundering and fraud and bribery and corruption, but even in the S, it's not just human rights like modern slavery. Under the S is privacy. And so ESG has significant ramifications on IT assets and things. And you've got the EU directive that's in play right now, expected to be passed in the next 2 months, and Germany's corresponding Corporations Due Diligence Act that's going to require organizations to show significant and ongoing due diligence in their extended enterprise relationships in context of E, S, and G including the security aspects and things. And it's going to have a huge global ramification like GDPR compliance did.
Yeah, that's, when you think about it, it's, the spectra is enormous. What IT security, IT compliance touches, it's staggering. One last questions, and then we'll go to the poll, and then we'll answer some questions because there are many. So, that's a good sign. People are interested. I'm going to be a bit debating here. How to not make people the weakest link in your IT compliance or IT security strategy. We know that 60% of cyber attacks are due to inadequate employee behavior, what we call shadow IT, downloading apps on your mobile or on your PC that are, not approved by your IT security. How do you cope with that?
In one sense, it's always going to be our weakest link because people have access to systems and processes. They make mistakes. Some are malicious. Some are just inadvertent. And so we need to have a strong security awareness program and monitoring capability and engagement of that first line out there. So policies and training are critically important. If I roll back 20 years ago, I remember that there used to be an IT security company called Pentana down in Austin, it was Houston, Texas, and they got acquired by somebody else, and I can't remember the trace of it, but they had this whole concept called the human firewall. Just as we have, our network firewalls, we need the human firewall, and then that's a strong security awareness and training program to be able to make sure people understand. And we even have to do it within our own personal lives. train my wife and things to on how to be cautious around all those emails coming in. And even when somebody calls, like she got a call from somebody that was trying to pretend they're Apple support that wanted her access code to her iPhone. And she was wise enough to say, no, this isn't legit. You know, we need to train not only our employees, but even our families and things on this. Fraud's becoming very complex.
Yeah, and as we discussed, I mean, cyber criminals are, getting clever and clever. And with the use of deep fake, I mean, it's also quite impressive because, they can impersonate people. And I mean, it's not science fiction now, it's real. Let's go to our last polling question, and then we'll try to answer some question. So obviously we discussed, the importance of integrating your IT compliance, again, IT security within your ERM strategy. At the current time, I mean, how does it look in your organization? Is it not at all integrated, a little, but you wish it was more integrated, or fully integrated? And that brings me to a question that we had around this subject. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, I'm going to throw it to you, Michael. So what is the best and easiest way to secure and protect the company's data from breaching if the system, IT compliance, and ERM strategy are not fully integrated or cannot be integrated together due to any reason? So if there is no connection between, the IT part and the ERM, I mean, how can you do it? Which I assume is the case for many companies.
Right now, you need to work on finding a way to integrate your enterprise risk strategy with your IT risk strategy. I mean, any company that is ignoring, IT risk in their ERM strategy is headed for disaster today. But the ERM strategy also needs to be balanced, because I've found many organizations where their enterprise risk or operational risk strategy is dominated by IT security. And you would think that's their only risk. And so they're ignoring like environmental risks and health and safety risks, and they got caught off guard with COVID-19 preparation. So we need balanced enterprise risk management programs, but the pervasiveness of technology and IT assets and information really requires that we have some type of integrated ERM strategy that clearly understands and applies the IT risks in the environment. So if these are disconnected areas and the organization is not doing anything to address it, you've got a hard row to hoe.
Now we can see the result. I mean, interesting. We can see that it's, a little. I'm not surprised by those results. I don't know, Michael, but yeah, I was counting on B to be, the winner. So B is a little, but we can see. C is also, not too bad at 36%, which is, if you count it with the fully integrated, that's 46%. So it's almost half. They're integrated and half is not integrated or getting there. What do you make of those numbers?
And I think we're seeing things like solar winds. Now the Colonial Pipeline's getting a lot more attention to drive some of this momentum for integration. So I think we're going to see some of these numbers move over the next year. I think COVID-19 has also pushed some of these numbers to move. Yeah.
And I think, we have a question. We talked a lot about, people having to work, assurance group working with IT. And then we have a question on that, which I think is really relevant to what we just discussed. How do you get IT to buy into working with audit and risk management areas within the organization? It's true they've always been very siloed. How do you make all those people, again, as you mentioned, like the free line models, work together in this symbiotic way?
The best way to do it, if it's not working now, is to get executive support and sponsorship that says you will work this way. There's a lot of companies that have a lot of cultural challenges because departments, were allowed a lot of autonomy and silos and brick walls around them, and they don't like to share data. And you still have those type of issues. And so to really emphasize change is you need to have a cultural change in the organization that encourages collaboration to address these complex risks that the world faces. And if you need a cultural change to do that, pretty much the only way you're going to get that is through top level executive support.
Yep. Turn from the top, obviously, because that at the end of the day, that's basically, what it all comes down to. It's really turn at the top and have management setting the direction and, you know, showing and demonstrating good behavior. I don't know if we have, you know, we have 30 seconds. I'm just going to throw that one because we had someone that said if you could repeat the name of the EU directive, which is going to be approved on TPRM and due diligence.
Yeah. Oh, I mentioned two. One is already approved. Yeah. I mean, you have the EU DORA, Digital Operation Resiliency Act, that was passed last fall. But the one that I was referring to was the EU directive, and just let me pull it up. I wrote about it in my blog last week, and it's got this detailed...
Yeah, while you're looking for it, Michael, I'm just going to remind the audience, I mean, to subscribe to your GRC report that comes out, I think, every week. I think it's on Thursday. And there is a wealth of information on GRC. Not all IT, but... Yeah, go ahead.
It is the EU directive on mandatory human rights, environmental, and good governance due diligence. And it's very expansive because good governance includes a lot of things in there, which you could even apply security, but also, you know, bribery and corruption and fraud and all these different aspects to it. And it requires significant due diligence in your extended enterprise relationships in this matter. Germany's already written their corresponding law called the Corporate Due Diligence Act.
Yep.
And roughly, I have a whole blog on this, how ESG in the extended enterprise, you know, ESG is about to rock the third-party risk world and shift it around quite a bit. But, you know, it's the understanding right now that, you know, these laws are probably going to apply to anybody that has more than 250 employees or, you know, more than 50 million euros in annual revenue. It doesn't have to be 50 million in Europe. It doesn't have to be 250 employees in Europe. But if you have any presence in Europe, you know, just like GDPR, if you have EU citizen data, even if you're a U.S. organization, you have to address GDPR. The same thing with this. If you have any presence in Europe, you're going to have to respond to this directive or particularly the corresponding country laws. And Germany is the first one to really push forward with it with the Corporate Due Diligence Act.
Well, thank you, Michael, for this precision. I want to thank you again for this exchange. I mean, that was, the hour just flied. That was very interesting. I mean, I learned a lot. I hope the audience did as well. We couldn't answer all the questions, but we will get back to you. Someone is asking for the URL for your blog. I think if they just type Michael Rasmussen GRC 2020, I think they will find it. With that, I don't know, Jack, if you want to close the session. And again, thank you, Michael, for your availability and your knowledge.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, guys. So I'll close this session out. I want to say a big thank you to Cyril and Michael for the great presentation and Q&A session. As we conclude the webinar, please remember that if you completed watching the required 50 minutes, your CPE certificate will automatically appear in the ISACA CPE records of your ISACA account. Please remember that this process can take up to 48 hours for the CPE credit and certificate to be added to your CPE manager. This webinar was recorded. You will be able to go back to watch it from the virtual events section in your classroom within the ISACA Learning Access page within 48 hours. This webinar and the information contained in it are not directed to or intended for distribution or use by any person. Again, I would like to thank our amazing sponsor, Mega International, as well as Cyril and Michael for their time, expertise, and great information today. To everyone who was able to join us for this webinar, thank you for your attention and participation, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.